Hello everyone, welcome to our webinar today. We're going to be talking today about reflexive writing in qualitative software. And it's something which you can find a couple of posts on our blog about talking about in more detail, but I wanted to kind of demonstrate using Quirkos as an example how you can use qualitative data analysis software for a lot more than just doing coding. You can also use it to keep a lot of other aspects of your research project together as you go along. And we're going to talk about various different types of reflexive writing, how you can capture them in qualitative software, and why you might want to choose some of these techniques. So I'm going to go through very briefly to start some of the different types of reflexive writing that I see. The first of these is process, where you talk about the process of what you're doing. The other one is person. So that's reflexivity about who you are, your biases, your background. And the last one is the data itself. So when you're talking about doing through the analysis process, using reflexive writing as a way to understand the data. So personal reflexivity is probably the most commonly understood term, especially in social sciences and qualitative research. It's where we talk about and make very conscious our own biases as researchers. We talk about our backgrounds, our privilege, how we ended up being how we are, with the understanding that we are taking a kind of post-positivistic view, that we are assuming that it's not possible to be completely neutral when we analyze and interpret qualitative data, although that applies for any kind of data or science. And therefore, while we should be taking all the steps we can to minimize bias within our research, we should also be trying very hard to make our own kind of biases and understanding explicit, so that the reader and someone else can understand for themselves any of the kind of processes that may have influenced our interpretation of the data. And so one of the reasons we do that is to reduce bias. Another reason that we do that is also to make us conscious of our own process, so our own reasons that we might interpret data in a particular way. And one of the very common ways in which this is done in the literature is reflexivity statements, sometimes also called positionality statements. There's a blog post on these which I'll put a link to in the description below that will tell you a lot more about these. But basically it's a process, and you can see it sometimes when people are doing PhDs or if they're writing a journal article, where they will actually start by introducing themselves, saying who they are, talking about their age, their race, their gender, other characteristics like that that might influence how they look at and interpret the data, and especially their positionality with regards to the data. Are they someone that they would see associating with the participant? Is it something like autoethnography, where the researcher is actually very closely connected to the context? Or is it someone who's looking as an outsider into a process they don't understand? Are they looking from a Western privileged country into research which is being done into a developing country? Or are they trying to, as an academic researcher, understand a very different context, such as how minors interact socially or something like that? So reflexivity statements are one of the ways that we can improve the quality of research by looking at our own reflexivity. Another way is to have a process for understanding the reflexivity of the research process itself. And what I mean by that is when we're going through and we're recording the data, collecting the data, and when we're going through the analysis and interpretation of the data, we are keeping a log basically of how we do that process. Now it seems a bit strange to call this a type of reflexivity, but it is actually a way of reflecting back and understanding the process, the decisions that we made as fallible researchers during the analysis and data collection process. So these might be reflections on how the data collection went, if there are any kind of problems or issues, especially if we're doing things like focus groups and semi-structured interviews, the kind of mainstays of qualitative analysis. And the way this is normally done is through reflexive journals. So again, there's another blog post article which will talk about this in a lot more details, and the link to that will be in the description. Reflexive journals are basically a research diary that we keep during the research project, and we use to not only kind of call to account any kind of decisions we make or problems that we have, so that later when we're writing up we can go back and decide, well, why did I decide to use that method, or why did I interview that particular person, but also to talk about our own reflexivity during the process. So when we have challenges, when we may be emotionally distressed by the data, or times when we're just not quite sure how to interpret it, and again when we come back to write up the data, be that for PhD or master's thesis or for a publication, it really helps us understand the process that we went through and to justify the decisions that we made when collecting, analysing and interpreting qualitative data. Now there's one other kind of, which is almost a kind of reflexivity, and that's reflexivity on the data itself. So when we're going through and analysing the data, we can use traditional methods like coding, but a lot of people will also do annotations, which are a type of reflexivity really upon the data itself. So annotations, notes and memos that help us to understand the data. And we're going to look at some of those here as well. We've not got a blog post article about this yet, but I'm hoping to write something a little bit more to explain what we mean by that. But it's basically using reflexivity, our own kind of querying and interpreting of the data as a way of understanding and summarizing it. In vivo analysis would be one example of that, and another would be kind of IPA and line by line coding. These all kind of rely on kind of a very kind of modular reflexivity approach that's very closely connected to the data. So to demonstrate how we would, or some different ways of managing this in the software and the advantages of doing that, we're going to look at how we do it in Quirkos. So that's a qualitative software analysis that we design. There are other tools as well. F4 Analysia, I want to give a particular shout out to, is designed to do analysis through writing. So there's a whole school of thought which says that the best way to analyze data, to think about it and to interpret it, is to start writing, to write and interpret and do that in a very kind of tactile way through lots of different types of writing. And F4 Analysia takes that that approach and puts it front and center in the interface. But it's possible to do in any qualitative analysis software. If you wanted to follow along while we're doing this, you can download the free trial from www.quirkos.com. And it's a trial of the full version. You can try the cloud or the offline version. And you can see the different ways in which you can do this type of reflexive analysis in the software. And one of the advantages of doing this in the software is that there are lots of different ways that you can keep track of it. You can analyze your own kind of reflexive data, and you can also keep it all in one place, which not only just helps with neatness, but also means that you can kind of cross-reference your data and things like your reflexive journal as well. Many people will keep things like a reflexive journal in paper. When I did my PhD, it was a physical diary, but keeping it in the software itself can actually be very beneficial. And I'll show some of the ways in which that can be. So I'm going to demonstrate in Quirkos here. This is the standard interface in Quirkos, and we're just looking here at some of the example projects that you can download while you're learning Quirkos. I'm not really going to look at very much of the features today in Quirkos. Basically, it's a bubble interface. You create these bubbles which represent themes or codes, drag and drop text onto a theme, and that's how you do the coding process of it. But there's a lot more to qualitative software like Quirkos than coding, and I'm going to take you through some of the ways that you can do that. So the most common ones is to do annotations of the text. So while we've gone through and analysed this using codes, we might not do that, especially if we're taking a line-by-line coding approach using something like IPA. Or if we want to go through and read the data closely before we start categorizing it, creating any kind of themes or codes. And so in Quirkos, this is done with the memos feature, and that's represented with this little bubble here, these kind of little kind of like cloud thought bubbles here. And in Quirkos, what we do is, rather than dragging and dropping a piece of text onto a theme or a code, we drag and drop it directly onto the memo column. And that creates a little bit like a sticky post-it note, a little annotation which is attached to that section of text. This piece of text here, we can talk about it. And we can write for ourselves, this person doesn't sound very sure. So that will be an example of kind of our own kind of personal reflexive annotation on the data. So that's our own kind of process of interpretation. If we were doing something like line by line or IPA encoding, we would say something like much more literal description. So diagnosed as wheat intolerant. And in Quirkos, if we've got overlapping memos, we can click on the bubble here to cycle through them. So we've got those two memos there, and by a process of going through either line by line or just with the interesting bits, we can annotate the text and keep our memos very close to the data. And in Quirkos, it's a very easy process, and anywhere where we see the quotes from the data, we'll also see those pop up. So if we look at the dislike code here, here's the memo here, always needs T attached to that particular section of text. So in Quirkos, you can click to minimize the memo column. So you'll always see the little icon which shows you which section text is a memo for. And if you want to double click on it, it will open the memo column so you can see and also edit the memo that you have there. You also right click to delete a memo if you don't find it appropriate at any stage. So that's a way of adding a annotation, so doing a piece of almost kind of reflexive writing to a particular extract of text. Now in Quirkos, you can also do that at the level of the whole source, and you do that using source properties. So the source properties, which are also known as the attributes in NVivo, called slightly different things in different software, basically the characteristics that you have of a particular source. So in this case, we have interview transcripts. So our source properties are basic kind of demographic data. So gender, age, city, date, and what kind of stakeholder they are in this example. But we can remove any of those that we need. But we can also create a property here, which is for our kind of own comments. And this happens at the level of the source. There's no limit to how long these can be. So I can have a comment for the source, and I can say, this person was clearly not very interested in the subject and not very medically savvy. So by doing that, we've now got a comment which we've attached to the whole source. So where the memos were attached just to a particular section of the text, we've got a way to comment about the whole source. And so here we've used this to give ourselves some important reflexive and contextual information. So this might be an observation that we made during the interview actually, that this person was nervous, and that's something that doesn't come across very clear in the transcript. Other things might be that you kept getting distracted. So that's a way of kind of keeping some kind of level of that kind of research journal. There's research notes about a particular source. There's no limit to how many of these you can have, and you can have them be as long as you need to. So that's a way of assigning text and writing at the level of a source. So one of the documents that you have in your project. Now, the other way that we can do this is actually through the chat function, which is in the most recent versions of Quirkos. Now, we originally created the chat function for the online collaborative version of Quirkos, so that if people are working on a project at the same time, they can see each other's updates in live, real time, be collaborating together on the same project. It would be useful to have a way to communicate with each other and say, hey, what are you doing, or why are you interpreting things in that way? But we also keep the feature in the offline version because it's such a useful way to keep a time-stamped diary or journal of the analysis process. So for example, your first entry, before you even put any sources into the project, might be like, I'm just started my analysis today, so excited. And when you do that, there's no limit to how long it can be, but you get your author name here and the date and timestamp, so you know how it goes on. And as you go, you can say, now I'm feeling a bit overwhelmed by the data on the second day, perhaps. You can make this column a bit higher if you're starting to have longer memos go on. And then you can also start talking about particular issues that you have. I'm not sure that the theme called time is named correctly. It is more like time pressures. And so there, as you go through the process of analysing and interpreting the data, you're also keeping a log of your kind of thoughts and your comments. And you can also keep this even during the data collection stage. So there's no reason that you can't start your project in qualitative software before you've even done your first interview or collected any data, but use something like this to keep track of the data. What it means is everything is in the same place. So you can search across this, you can export it with the rest of your files, and it's just very easy just to have one window open where you can keep track of these comments and thoughts and feelings at the same time that you're analysing and interpreting the data. So that's a good way of doing a kind of reflexive journal, or a what's sometimes called a analytic diary, or research diary or research journal. So called lots of different names in the literature, but basically meaning the same thing. But if you don't need this kind of timestamp pressure, and the way we did this in previous versions of Quirkos is you can actually create a source which becomes your reflexive journal. So I'm going to create a new blank source in Quirkos. I'm going to give it we're going to have a property here which is called source type, and I'm going to call this journal. That way it doesn't get confused with my other sources of data, which would be, for example, interview. What that means in the future is I can see my results just from my journal, or from the interviews, or across both of them. So that might be kind of useful. So I'm going to stop this being called source 5 and change this to say journal. Okay. So now we've done that, it's very easy to go back to the source here, right click to edit the source text, and now it's basically like typing in the word processor. So we can say I'm just starting my diary. Not sure how many codes I will end up with. I can just click save, and then I have a source of text here. And it may be that when I start talking about particular things, so Simon's source keeps talking about allergies, but I don't think he knows how they work. And now what that means is we can put this into we can code this in an appropriate place. We don't actually have one for allergies, which we probably should. So we can drag and drop that onto the plus bubble there and create a new one called allergies. Got a new allergies theme there, but it applies to diet as well. So we can code our source journal in the same way that we start coding the actual text of our interview transcripts. So let's put this section here where he's talking about allergies into the allergies theme we created. And now if we double click on the allergies bubble, we've got extracts here from our journal together with the source of text where we're actually talking about that issue or talking about this particular theme. So that's a way that we can create and code to particular themes or codes that we have across not only our sources of data, but also our own kind of reflexive journal, our own research diary. And using the query function in Quirkos, that's how we would restrict our results to one particular type of source. So here, for example, we've got the source type, and if we click journal, we'll see the data that we've coded. So we didn't put very much in there at this time, but there we've coded to allergies and diet. And by splitting the screen and running the side-by-side comparison view here, we can also see how that looks with the interview. So on the right now we have, this is how we've coded the data from the interviews, and on the left this is how we've coded our journal. But what we can easily do is exclude these particular ones. So if we wanted to have everything except our journal, we can add a query here with the and or all statements, or if we wanted to look at our journals, so if we click and keep source type and interview and journal, now if we update that, now we'll see results from or journal. Now we see the results from, again, both our sources of text and our sources of data. And again, it just is another way of keeping you closer to your data and connecting you not just with the data that you've connected, but also with your own process feedback, your own reflexivity on the process and the analysis as it goes on. So those are just some of the ways in Quirkos, and these are pretty much applicable, although the terminology and the tools might look slightly different to any kind of qualitative software that you have. But again, it can be a very neat way of keeping track of your data, especially if you're working with others. So things like the chat function here will also do a timestamp, but also note who's doing the particular analysis, who's doing the particular work there. So you've got that opportunity to collaborate, discuss, talk with each other. So the reflexivity becomes a kind of a team project as well as something that's just focusing at the individual level. So that's pretty much everything that I was going to cover in this session today. Again, please check the link in the descriptions below for the blog post articles which discuss some of this in greater depth. And I hope this is useful to kind of not only kind of challenge what you do with qualitative analysis software, but also to try and encourage more people to look at reflexivity, all its different types, as being quite an integral part of doing qualitative analysis.